Hi everyone, and welcome to the first lecture for English 1, Spaces for Writing, Part 1. So one of the things that I often do the first day in class is I really try to have students think about the ways in which we've classified ourselves as far as writing is concerned and labeled ourselves as a certain kind of writer. And one of the things that I often find is that when it comes to drafting, people put themselves into one of two boxes, right? They're the person who stares at a blank screen, or the person that has so many ideas that they can't possibly choose one and write an essay. And what I find is that that classification that we often give ourselves, sorry, I get a little tongue-tied, is really not a fair classification because for the most part, both of us are these two things, right? If not many other things. And depending on the writing situation, we are either going to have tons of ideas because we're so passionate about the topic, or our anxiety or the complexity of the idea is going to lead us to stare at a blank screen or a blank page. And so what I'm hoping is through the course of the next few weeks together that you will start to see the spectrum of possibility that exists within writing and start to see yourself as a writer who may not always sit down and know exactly what they want to write and write perfectly in the first sitting, right? The other thing I want us to think about is the space of writing and the possibility that exists within it. You know, oftentimes people will hear the word rhetorical thrown around, and that can take on a variety of meanings, and we'll talk about those meanings in class. But, you know, could be rhetorical devices like definition, description, illustration, argument, good old compare and contrast, right? But that's not really all that's meant by rhetorical. And oftentimes, or fundamentally, I guess, in my mind, rhetorical has to do with communication, right? It's our ability to take words and communicate ideas. And that can happen in a variety of ways. And so oftentimes, when we think of writing, we think of a very limited space because in many cases, writing has only been done in terms of, you know, your English teacher or teacher in other disciplines gives you an assignment and you have to sit down and write about it, right? But that's such a limited idea of what writing is. So when we think of space, right, we don't want to just think of like the universe of writing. We also want to think about the space on the page or screen, right, which we were talking about a minute or so earlier. And then we also want to think about the physical space in which we write, both the personal and the public. And then on top of that, we want to think about the space that's inside our brain, right? I mean, the space that we can't see where all these ideas and thoughts and feelings, right, are teeming around, or maybe teeming's not the right word, swimming around. And that, you know, these are all spaces that are very important to writing itself. And so I guess in my mind, regardless of how we feel, we need to think about how all of these spaces work together and against each other, right? Because if we're sitting in a space that we feel comfortable in, it may be easier for our ideas to flow. But as we've all witnessed in the last few months, right, with COVID-19, that, you know, what's going on in our heads has a direct impact on our ability to sit down and write or articulate our thoughts. And that the space in which we put them, where we write them, can also have an effect. So we need to think about when we're having issues with writing situations, we need to think about the ways in which those different spaces may be working for or against each other, right? And that a lot of times the success of our writing or lack thereof has to do with a disconnect among these things. So it's not that you're necessarily, well, all of us have opportunities to grow in writing. So you're not a bad writer. It's more so looking at how to maximize all these different spaces so that your writing can communicate ideas to your reader. because that's fundamentally what writing is supposed to be, a connection or expression of our ideas that a reader can then take and either have dialogue with us about it or use it to create innovations of their own. So this concludes the first lecture, and now we'll move on to the second one, which continues that idea of spaces for writing.